Welcome to this social statistics session of the Royal Statistical Society Conference. I'm Carol Haynes, Education Manager at the Royal Statistical Society. I'm delighted to welcome both speakers, Professor Simon Burgess, University of Bristol, and Professor Anna Vignoles, University of Cambridge. Today's session is titled Educational Inequalities Beyond COVID. Please do feel free to raise questions throughout the session. We plan to take one integrated set of questions and answers after the second presentation. I will now hand over to Professor Simon Burgess to begin the session. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk at this conference. This is a joint session by Anna Vignoles and myself. I'm going to go first, and I'm going to talk about inequalities in the experiences of remote schooling and the implications of lockdown for school-age students beyond COVID, that is to say in later life. So starting about inequalities in the experiences of remote schooling, I want to talk briefly about what resources you need in order to learn, and then to talk about the integration of schools and families in using online resources, and then come to talk about measures of inequality. So one of the most important findings, I guess, from the economics of education over the last few years has been the overwhelming importance of teachers in pushing student progress forwards. We know now that teacher effectiveness is incredibly important, and being taught by an effective teacher is gives you a big boost to student learning. So teaching really needs teachers. And I think probably a lot of families who didn't know that already become aware of that over the last few months as they've tried to help their children learn. So given this insight, how can we bring teachers in, both for understanding what's been happening over the last few months and for thinking about the future for potential partial or full school closures in local areas as we go forwards? So one option has been sort of fully interactive Zoom type lessons where students and teachers kind of interact in the same kind of way we're interacting in this conference. And some friends whose children go to private schools suggest that's to some degree what children have been experiencing there. They are interacting with their own teacher, with their own classmates, and apart from the fact they're all scattered around the country or the world, it's pretty much business as usual. So I think that's probably impossible to achieve for all students in all schools in this country. But something that comes very close and I think is really extremely useful is the idea of videoed lessons from top teachers. So in the UK, this is being done, I think, really well by the Oak National Academy. So these are not interactive. The teacher can't communicate with individual students, but the point is that it's a teacher. It's based on actual professional knowledge and ability, and those video lessons I think are very helpful in helping students learn if we have partial lockdowns again. So the point here is that we have co-production. There's provision of online materials by schools and their use by families. And in terms of the provision by schools, we've had a kind of a variation. At the best, the online material is kind of annotated or discussed by teachers. It's tailored to individual groups of students, and there's a nice collection been made. It's been curated by the teachers to maximize the learning experience. The other end of the scale, sometimes I've heard stories about people who basically the child has just been sent a URL, a link by the school. But the key point is that this is co-production. It's the quality of the provision by the schools to the families interacting with times by the resources for use by families, which I'm going to come on to in a moment. And the key point is that these things are, on average, going to be positively correlated. That is to say, the families who have a lot of resources at home to use the material provided by schools are typically going to their child is typically going to go to schools that are providing good material. So this is bound to exacerbate, to increase inequalities. So we have some results, some information about the provision by schools. I'm not going to go through all of these points, but you can get the general idea. This was from the National Foundation for Educational Research, NFER, and produced during the UK lockdown in May this year. So you can get the general idea. Teachers were in regular contact with just over half of their pupils. Less than half of pupils were returning work set by their teachers. Teachers said that almost all the pupils were doing less work than they would usually expect. And then in terms of the inequalities theme that we're running here, pupil engagement was lower in the more deprived schools. Parental engagement was lower in the more deprived schools. Access to IT was lower in the more deprived schools. And on top of all those sort of learning aspects, 3/4 of senior leaders of schools said their schools were also offering sort of welfare support to vulnerable pupils. So maybe food vouchers or parcels or something. The use by families interacts with that. So we know that families are central to education and they provide major inputs into a child's learning. So maybe in the first place, we thought this would actually work quite well. Families are really important. Families can help their kids learn. But typically, that family input is as a complement to school inputs rather than as the prime driver of learning. And families are going to differ a lot in a number of factors. And this is just a partial list, really. The first thing is a quiet place to study. So if you think of a family with two parents at home, both working, and maybe there's 2 or 3 kids, and our focused child we're thinking of is an 8-year-old, and there's an irritating and noisy younger sibling who's just sort of making a noise and running around and wanting to play. And most families are not going to have enough rooms in the house for all of those separate people to study or to work. So having a quiet place to study is really important. The amount of parental time available for teaching, also the knowledge of parents. I mean, it's much easier, obviously, to teach or to help your child learn algebra or genetics or poetry if you yourself have got a good grasp of what's going on. I think also very important is the non-cognitive skills, the traits of parents, the level of patience, their level of persistence in trying to help their child get through this and understand what's going on. So I've put IT kit at the bottom of this list, and I think that's appropriate. I think that's much less important than these other points that I've made. But of course, this is the only one in the list that government, that policy can do something about quickly and immediately. Okay, you see, relatively easy to say, okay, let's just buy laptops for all of these kids. Let's just help them get fast internet. Can't do anything about the other things. So in a sense, part of the part of the discussion that's policy driven is about the less important things on this list. It kind of has to be that way. So we have variable quality provision by schools and quantity. We have variable ability of families to make use of this. So we're going to see inequality increase. There are different ways of looking at this. So the Education Endowment Foundation, EEF, conducted a meta-analysis of the evidence available at the time, and their central estimate of the change in the attainment gap between poor and non-poor families was an increase of around a third, 36% increase in this gap. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, IFS, ran a survey of parents of school-aged children in April and May this year. They found the same kind of thing. Children in the richest quintile of families were spending over an hour per day more on schoolwork than children in the poorest quintile of households. And again, obviously, students from richer families more likely to have access to private tutoring, technology, and other resources, including individual discussions with teachers, which, given what I was saying earlier, is obviously really important. And there are other surveys that have taken place through the year. I think it's really impressive the amount of data that people have been able to generate already on the various issues here, and they're finding very similar sorts of things. So in terms of thinking about inequality, we have noisy measures of input into learning, so how much time spent, how much stuff sent from school, that kind of thing. We have reports of how engaged pupils, parents have been. But it would be really nice to have a measure of outcomes, educational outcomes. And that's very hard because, there's obviously no testing really took place before the summer holidays. Department for Education, I believe, has a project to try and measure learning loss, very soon over the next few weeks. For the Royal Society report that Anna and I led a few weeks ago, we really wanted some outcome data, and we were able to access some data from online learning platforms, which are outcomes, which are test scores, albeit zero stakes test scores. And this is what we found. So this is a measure of variability or inequality, if you like, of test scores on this platform. So on the horizontal axis here, I've got pre-lockdown, post-lockdown. The vertical axis is the interquartile range, so a measure of the variability of test scores for 4 different school years here. The blue line at the bottom is year 3, all the way up to year 9, at the orange line at the top. And what you see here is just over these few months, a huge difference, a huge increase in the gap between low scorers and high scorers. The high scorers are pulling away; they're still increasing their learning, and the people who were scoring low at the bottom, that's not true at all. Okay, so for the primary school years, these are increasing something close to 50% over just a few months, and for the older children, a lower increase, but still maybe 10-15%. So this is sort of the summary of the first part of my talk. The experiences of learning through lockdown have been to increase inequality. So the second part, I'm going to talk about the implications of lost learning for students, and talk about assessments changed or missed assessments because of the pandemic. So most pupils in the UK have missed around about 12 weeks of face-to-face learning. So that's around about a third of a school year. So the impact of that, as we're going to see, is substantial. I think the impact is likely to be greater still for younger children, because we know that learning builds on learning. And if you start with a gap between where you are and where you should be when you're a young learner, unless we do something about it, then that gap's just going to rise and rise. So we're interested in a causal impact of missed schooling on skills. If you miss this amount of schooling, what is the gap between what your skills are and what they should be? So to do that, we need something that's going to provide some quasi-random, some exogenous variation in the amount of time that kids are in school. So the evidence that we've put together looks at school closures because of some events. So natural catastrophes such as Hurricane Katrina, weather extremes such as schools shut for weeks on end because of snow, teacher strikes, large-scale teacher strikes in Argentina, and other kind of quasi-random settings. Studies like that suggest that the amount of schooling missed by students in the UK is going to lead to something like a 6%, 10% standard deviation fall in the skills of the students. So that's one way of trying to estimate the lost learning. We take studies of other things and we extrapolate them to this case. Another way is to survey teachers. So again, the NFER have just a few days ago published a report looking at the impact of lockdown on where students are. And the teachers report that they estimate that their pupils in July, I think, were around 3 months behind in terms of their learning. And once again, that the students in more deprived schools were further behind still. So the estimate is that the gap between disadvantaged pupils and their more affluent peers has increased by around 46% since the start of the pandemic. So kind of, similar kind of ballpark of figures, really not good news. So what are the implications? For the individual, your earnings depend on your skills on average, and a huge amount of evidence suggests that. So lower skills mean lower earnings. And a very kind of transparent, straightforward way of estimating that is if a student misses a third of a school year and the rate of return to a school year is around about 10%, then we might expect, roughly speaking, a 3% fall per year in your earnings capacity. Again, that's likely to be a bigger fall for children who experience this in their primary school years. Evidence from the teacher strikes in Argentina, which were quasi-random in terms of exposure, suggests that the average strike incidence there were reducing earnings in midlife for women by around 2% and men around 3%. At a national scale, thinking of the economy as a whole, lower aggregate skills are going to reduce the growth rate. And I think one important point here is that we tend to focus on the two cohorts of students who've had really important key stakes, high stakes exams this year. But it's much more than that. There are 13 cohorts of students, 13 years worth of students have been affected by this lockdown and have missed a third of a year of schooling. So by the time the youngest of those students make it into the labour force by the mid-2030s, and for decades after that, as everybody just ages through, around a quarter of the entire workforce are going to have lower skills than they otherwise would have done, unless we can do something about it. This in turn means a lower growth rate, and the cost of a lower growth rate is measured in billions of pounds, not millions. Looking at Argentina again, the aggregate earnings loss in Argentina in this really nice paper suggests that the cost is around $2 billion per year for that obviously much smaller economy. A consequence of lost skills is a greater risk of poverty. Okay, so for example, people with lower levels of attainment are 5 times as likely to be in poverty as those with a high level. So there's a huge link there. And of course, we know there's a very substantial literature linking poverty to ill health and to early death, although sometimes the causality there is very hard to disentangle. So here's one example of that kind of evidence. The point is that this is not about lives versus money. This is about the risk of losing lives through COVID infection against the risk of shortening lives really quite considerably by closing schools and children missing out on learning. So my final topic here is about assessments in schools that have been changed or missed. So internal formative assessments, I'm sure schools simply didn't bother with those. And this is not trivial. This provides useful data for schools to see who's struggling, to see who needs interventions and extra help and so on. But I guess all of the attention has been on the external, the high stakes assessments, the exams for qualifications, such in this country as the GCSEs or the A-levels. And these are really important. The key decisions are placed on these. They're really helpful in the labour market. You can miss or get a job based on these qualifications. You can miss or get a place at university, and various other human capital investments are based on these qualifications. So what do we have to do? Different countries tried different approaches, cancelling exams, postponing them, replacing them. In the UK, the relevant body Ofqual decided to use modelling along with teacher centre assessed grades and ranks of students. I'm not going to get into the pros and cons of this. It's very controversial. The RSS was involved in that controversy kind of from the outside, obviously, as opposed to from the inside. The point I want to make is that using teacher assessment is not uncontroversial. There's an evidence from a number of countries that non-blind teacher assessments can be biased relative to exam grades. So I'm just going to illustrate that here with some data from a paper I did a while ago with Ellen Greaves, where we had data on teacher assessment. So TA is teacher assessment against a key stage test, the KS. And these were both trying to measure the same thing. And this example is in maths. So with the vagaries of exams, you have a lucky day, you have an unlucky day. Sometimes the exam score of a pupil is going to beat the teacher assessment, beat what the teacher thought they could do. Sometimes it's going to be lower. And in the data set as a whole, that's roughly true. But you can see here that the most important row here is the bottom row, that for disadvantaged students, they were dramatically more likely to beat what their teacher thought, to do better than what their teacher thought they could do, than to do worse. So this is the worry. The worry is that teachers may not spot the true potential of students maybe by gender, maybe by ethnicity, maybe by social class, as we see here. So at some point, I guess we'll get the data to see how that panned out in this particular case. We don't have that yet, but hopefully someone will be able to do that now. So just to summarise, we've seen a full national closure of all schools in the UK for obvious reasons. One of the things that this has led to is an increasing inequality in schools, in skills from lack of schooling. The implications of that beyond COVID for these kids are lost learning, lower skills, reduced life chances. And we've seen the replacements, the alternatives for high stakes testing not done very well. Okay, so that's me done. I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to Anna.
Thank you all very much for listening to this webinar, and thank you to the Royal Statistical Society for inviting us to do this. I'm now going to shift focus away from the losses associated with learning into other impacts that we think have happened because of the lockdown, and focusing particularly on physical and mental health, as Simon said, and well-being. I'm also going to think a little bit about how students who might be leaving the compulsory school system into university and such like are going to experience post-COVID, or at least during COVID, I should say. So I think the most important point to make at this stage is that we started with a problem. And not only that, but lockdown is not the only problem. So first of all, we know there is, as Simon said, this long-run relationship between poverty in childhood and poor physical and mental health in adulthood. So we'd already had the Marmot Review, which highlighted the fact that the UK developed quite a major problem in this area after the Great Recession. The follow-up report by Bennett et al. In 2018 confirmed that that increase in inequality had not been reversed. So we're coming into COVID against this backdrop of increasing health and mortality inequalities. So that is obviously a great concern. But the big issue is that whilst lockdown will have some immediate impacts on children and young people, and I'm going to talk about those in a minute, possibly, as Simon alluded to, the biggest impact from COVID is not really going to be on the period of lockdown that children experience so much as the economic impact and the consequences that has for future generations. And I'll talk about that a little bit. So what do we think lockdown's actually done in terms of health? We know from previous evidence that when children are not in school, they are less active, they have worse diets, they sleep poorly or more poorly, and tend to gain weight. Some of that might be associated with the holiday feeling and the notion that parents let children do different things during holidays. But when you take the evidence in the round, and particularly focusing on the most disadvantaged children, actually what you see is that when children are not in school and don't have that structure and don't have the free school meal and don't have the activity, PE, such like associated with school, as well as a few other things, then lots of aspects of their physical and mental health can potentially deteriorate because of the things they're not doing. So we anticipate going into this that remote schooling is going to have a negative impact on both physical health and, in a minute, I'll show on mental health. I'm not sure Simon mentioned it already, but we've got a summary of all the evidence we've been talking about today in our Royal Society report, which is at the link when these slides are shared. So first of all, the big issue on mental health. As I've said already, we had a problem. Pre-COVID, the UK estimated to have about 1 in 8 school children with some sort of impairing mental health problem, and that rises to up to a quarter of teenage girls. Further, it wasn't entirely clear why we had had that rise. Lots of hypotheses about why it might have occurred. But what we can see is that our mental health services were experiencing more demand than they could cope with. So we went into this situation in quite a difficult circumstances. And the first thing that happened during the early months of lockdown was that the psychology community got together and did a huge number of systematic reviews, meta-analyses and such like, all of which are at the links below, which clearly indicated that lockdown was going to have a major negative impact on children and young people's mental health. And indeed, the government has now published some of that work on its own, confirming that one of the groups most severely impacted by COVID in terms of seeing a decline in their mental health well-being are young people, young adults. So why do school closures matter? I think it's important that we understand why schools might, or rather the lack of schooling might have a negative impact on students' mental health. So schools aren't just places of learning. They also provide the other things that children need for their development. First of all, children need strong attachments to adults other than their parents. Often that role is played by teachers. Perhaps even more crucially, school is a socializing place. Children benefit from interactions with their peers. It's where they learn to talk to their peers. They get social competence. They develop a sense of autonomy, the ability to relate to others. These are all crucial aspects. I mean, they're crucial for children's development. And further down the line, they're also crucial for their function in the world of work and beyond school. And schools are playing a key role in fostering these. We've got a good evidence base that that's what they do. And apologies for that. And basically, what we're saying here is that the removal of schooling has a potentially massively negative impact on that. Now, another aspect of this pandemic was that because parents are sitting at home struggling, as Simon alluded to teach young children, I think there's been a temptation to think that that's where the real problems lie. And from a parent perspective, it has been incredibly challenging trying to teach primary school children remotely with probably remarkably little input from anyone else. It's very difficult. But actually, if you look at the psychological literature, we might be more concerned about the adolescent group from the mental health perspective and the sort of risk that incurs for those children or young people. And the reason for this is that the social interactions and the relationships that adolescents form are vital. It's where they start to form those independent relationships with their peers and they move them on to a different level. It's a period where they have a great need for that social connectedness of belonging. They need to practice, they need to interact with their peers. And again, there's really good evidence from pre-pandemic days that in a causal sense, adolescents who are lonely and less connected then go on to have more physical health problems and indeed mental health problems. And so this is no doubt a critical period. And Sarah Jane Blakemore in particular has done a huge amount of work showing that this is a critical period for adolescents' development from a mental health perspective. But it's also a period during which some adolescents develop mental health conditions. And during the lockdown, as well as experiencing that lack of social connectedness, of course, there's been an impact on public services. So we have this period of time during which adolescents are at greater risk of developing some of these problems, and yet they've been very unlikely to be able to get help with that in terms of public services during the pandemic. So I think that's a particular added risk for some young people. So if we summarize the evidence that we have from pre-pandemic days, combined with some evidence from the pandemic itself, what do we think is going to happen? So it's undoubtedly true that the risk seems to be greater for those who went into the pandemic with a pre-existing mental health condition, as you would expect. But I think what's really emerging from the literature is also that the impact on mental health is going to be greatest for poorer students and those in stressed households. And by that, I mean households that may be experiencing poverty, that may be struggling because of lack of space, households where two parents are struggling to work and yet remote school the child. And indeed, households where there are domestic relationship problems and abuse. Now, some of those problems are, hopefully, we're talking about the past to some degree, in the sense that, for example, trying to have two working parents and a child being schooled. Now that they're back at school, maybe that problem has eased somewhat. But there are two things. One, we may go back into lockdowns, or we're likely to go back into lockdowns for schools. So this is not a problem that's gone away. But also some of those other problems around poverty, impact of COVID on jobs, stress, domestic relationships are going to be ongoing. And so we need to be mindful that this is going to be impacting on that group particularly hard. As I've already said, we think it's particularly difficult for adolescents, and the lack of access to public services or mental health services in particular is an issue. Now, again, remember I said that we had a problem before the pandemic in terms of access to mental health services. Many schools feel that they have children who are in need, who aren't able to access mental health services on a normal day. After and during this pandemic, it's got a lot worse. And in terms of the evidence that's emerged already, there's some great studies that link there, which have confirmed that adolescents do seem to be particularly negatively impacted, but also vulnerable children, those with particular conditions such as autism, and indeed children in care. The evidence base is sort of emerging, I would say, and the nice thing is that there's a whole range of data on mental health that should be coming online. So some of it will be focused on young adults and adults, but some of it will also be on primary and secondary age children. And it's really important that, in 6 months' time, we have another look at this evidence to see what's actually happened. The other thing is, what can we do about it beyond waiting for the evidence to tell us how bad it is? I think the thing that Simon and I were most keen to stress with our colleagues who contributed to the Royal Society report was that we shouldn't just focus on learning. We need to think more broadly than that. We need schools to be both, thinking about child wellbeing, which of course they are, but also beyond that, actually trying to measure the loss so that we then have the evidence that we will need to essentially justify a greater investment in schools and young people in order to mitigate the effects that both Simon has been talking about in terms of learning and I've been talking about in terms of mental health. And the other thing I think we need to be really mindful of is there is a group that have essentially left the school system and may or may not be entering university or other forms of learning and indeed the workforce. And those transitioning between those two phases are likely to have experienced quite a shock. They had their A-levels cancelled, etc., but also on the mental health side may need additional support. So we need to be mindful when they move to the next phase, which is indeed what I'm going to briefly talk about to end my talk. So thinking about higher education, this is an interesting one. So when COVID hit, it was widely assumed that the impact on universities would be massive, that it would negatively impact student demand, not least because of safety fears, but also because students at the university level have the option, of course, not to go to university for a year, to defer. And it was felt that nobody would want to start university in the middle of a pandemic. And the issue that some economists, indeed ourselves, were worried about was also that families' financial situations are going to deteriorate, and that also might create a barrier. So far, predictions about student numbers are proving wrong. And I think there are two unrelated reasons for this. I mean, focusing on the UK students for a moment, not to go over what Simon said about the assessment at A-level, but the net effect of all of that controversy is that we've had a dramatic increase in A-level grades. Universities at the top end have been allowed to expand. There's a concern they may, if you like, hoover up the students from lower down, but that's somewhat offset by the fact that it's a bumper crop of students who have the grades to go to university at all levels. And just to show you the data on that, overall, at this stage in the UCAS cycle, applications are up by 1%. We've taken a hit on EU students, as you might expect, but that could be more Brexit related than COVID related. And the really interesting one is, well, I guess two interesting things. UK students have stayed steady, but the non-EU numbers have actually gone up. That was not what was predicted. What was predicted was including by ourselves, quite a dramatic fall. But what we didn't count on was, I think, that there's probably a lot of deflection going on, i.e. students who are going to the US, taking a look at what's going over there and deciding that maybe another country would be a better option. But also, these students actually haven't turned up yet. So I think before we get too positive about the data that I'm showing you there, which looks like business as usual, possibly even more positive, we'll have to see whether they turn up in October and what that means for universities. But even if we're a bit more optimistic about the numbers than we were a few months ago, there are still the issues that we raised. The first being this problem that for poor students, the state support for living costs is unlikely to be enough to support them through their university. Most students work. And of course, what's happened with the pandemic is those sectors that students work in are disproportionately affected. And so students are unable to do the part-time work they would normally do. And that could have serious welfare implications or cause dropout. The other issue, which is the one Simon has alluded to, is this loss of learning. I think it needs to be clear that we might have a bumper crop of students coming in, but they've had a very rough time. They've had 3 months loss of learning, as Simon talked about, but they've also had that sort of rather crunching end to their schooling. And then because the teacher awarded grades are on average a lot higher than the grades that were achieved by last year's cohort in the exams, many of them will then be going to university with a higher grade, but probably poorer preparation for the degree. And universities really obviously need to be very mindful of this. If we're trying to find positives from all of this, essentially we've got a great big experiment here. We have a widening participation experiment. We're going to see students from poor backgrounds in institutions where in a previous year they would not have been able to get in because their grades in the examination would not have been high enough. And so particularly among low-income students, we're going to see them in institutions that are higher ranked than average. And of course, we can then follow them and look at their outcomes. It's not, I hope, going to be the perfect experiment, because obviously what universities will also need to do is mitigate the effects of their loss of learning and provide more support. So what is the HE experience going to look like, and what might we be worried about? So most universities at the moment are saying that they're going to offer blended learning. And there's an economics observatory piece on this, and you can look at the evidence on this. And blended learning can be very effective. I think it's also worth saying that in many universities, for example, big lectures have been recorded, and universities have seen declining in-person attendance at them anyway. So if a blended model is allowed to proceed, or if it succeeds, then it might not be as dissimilar to normal as we might think. But of course, what we're seeing over recent weeks is the US experience in universities with big spikes in COVID transmission. So it's clear what we need. We need a student asymptomatic testing regime so that we can really see where the infection bubbles are rising. And my hope is that we can achieve that rapidly, because then perhaps we won't go down the US route. But at the moment, it looks like if the US experience were to occur here, once again, we'll be shifting online during the year. It's a distinct possibility anyway. What does that mean? So the quality of online provision is an issue. There are some very high quality online courses, but there's limited evidence on whether or not it's more or less effective when it's fully online. What we do see, however, perhaps unsurprisingly, which mirrors the experience in the school system, is that disadvantaged students and low-income students, particularly low-achieving students, tend to struggle more with a fully online provision. So I think that's, again, something universities are going to have to be very mindful of. Essentially, you've got a big cohort coming in who are less prepared, tend to be more disadvantaged, and then if you put them into online provision, we're going to have to work harder to make sure that we try to compensate for that. And that, of course, is difficult. Universities are facing losses, financial losses, so investment in the kit and the technology, and indeed the people time needed to make the online experience perfect is not necessarily going to be there for it at every institution, and that's going to be a real challenge. But broadly speaking, we do know what we should be doing, just as we know what we should be doing in the school system. If you want to mitigate some of that learning loss, you need more tutoring, more individual attention. But as in the school system, where the state might struggle to pay for that, in universities, costs are rising, and even though the provision may be online and students may feel quite aggrieved at paying a full tuition fee, actually the costs this year are likely to be higher because of the precautions that universities are having to take for COVID. So it's a real challenge. So just to conclude, I mean, I think the work that Simon and I have been doing over the last few months with our colleagues really emphasizes the need for our policy makers to take a real focus on children and youth. They are at relative low risk of COVID themselves, but they are indeed paying a very heavy price for our response to COVID. That is not to say that we shouldn't have shut schools or whatever, but it is very clear that we need a COVID policy for children and youth, and that would imply greater investment in trying to mitigate some of the losses, both the learning losses and the negative impacts on children that I've been talking about. We have some clear ideas from the existing evidence base as to how you might spend that investment, but what we need is a clear acknowledgement that schools cannot go back, universities cannot go back and try and sort of recreate normal with no additional resource and expect to mitigate some of the impacts that we've been talking about. At the moment, schools are literally opening as we speak, and it's a hard slog. And the additional resource has not yet been forthcoming sufficient to really invest in mitigating some of the losses that these children have experienced. And then finally, I think the other thing to bear in mind was the slide I started with is underneath all of this, even if we get the mitigation in place to recover from the 3-month loss of schooling, the economic impact of COVID is going to be here for a long time, as everybody knows. And what that will mean is that the youth in particular who are trying to leave the school system or trying to leave the university or FE system during the next few years are going to have a very, very hard time in a very rough labour market. And so again, this sort of calls for a COVID policy for children and youth that acknowledges the COVID generations and the impact that the pandemic has had on them. Thank you.
Simon, for your very interesting and informative discussion. It's really really helpful to hear, looking at sort of the wider scope in terms of inequality in education, in terms of really looking at how it can affect well-being, as well as looking at learning loss as well. So that's really helpful. I wonder if we could ask some questions that we've had in through, and please feel free to share any more questions that you might have. So if I can turn first to, in terms of Anna, we have a question here. If social relations within peers and teachers impacts development, well-being, etc., then surely the effect of school closures will vary. So I think the question is around sort of the variation of school closures and how that will impact, what impact that would make. So I wonder if you could answer that question, Anna. Thank you.
That's absolutely right. So if we imagine the lockdown had been complete with no contact beyond the family for 3 months, then clearly we could see the negative impacts would affect all children. But of course, that's not happened. As Simon described, some schools have been doing very interactive daily Zooms with children. It may be harder to form relationships and bond over Zoom, but there's a lot of social contact involved in that. For school children who have been given a set of sort of written materials at the beginning of the week and have had very minimal, say half an hour with a teacher over the course of an entire week, essentially they've been socially isolated or isolated from their school and teachers. And so I think the variation that we see in the learning loss is going to be mirrored in the variation in the negative impact on well-being and mental health. And we do need to measure that so that when schools are thinking about what they should be doing with these cohorts over the next year, they can take that into account, which I know schools are fully aware of.
That's really helpful, thank you. And following on from that, do you know if anyone's looked into whether children with have actually benefited in any way from teacher relations during the time of school closures, whether anyone has done any research in that sense at all?
So I take it from that question that you mean whether some teachers in some circumstances have been able to support children and build those relationships despite being remote. I haven't seen any research looking into that specifically, but certainly sort of more qualitative evidence is that it is possible to do that. And some, indeed, in some surveys, some young people have not been experiencing negative impacts in terms of their well-being. Indeed, there may even be a subgroup who quite like to be at home and having less social interaction with their peers. Now, whether that is beneficial long-term is another question, but so there will be variation in this. I think the question is the right one, however, because going back to what Simon said about what do we do when and if we have to close schools again, I think understanding that those relationships are really important might change how we think about what online provision should look like. I don't know if Simon wants to come in here from the learning perspective, but certainly from the sort of social connectedness and the mental health perspective, that face-to-face interaction, albeit on Zoom, might be prioritised more given the evidence that we've had of the impact of the pandemic so far.
Simon, did you want to add anything to that?
I don't really have anything to add on that. I mean, completely agree with what Anna just said. Yeah, I mean, I am sure that there's been a lot of learning going on at school level, as well as at a national level about, how we did in the full lockdown in the spring, and lessons that we can learn for that from what we do now. Obviously, we're all hoping that school closures will be maybe just part of the school, maybe just a year group, maybe some kids. And if it needs a full school closure, then as brief as possible. So I think it's a different situation, and I'm seriously hope we've all done some learning about how the first one worked out.
Thank you, both for your answers on that. And then following on from that question, and another one which is kind of similar as well. Are there any upsides at all? For example, building resilience, strengthening families. And I wonder, Anna, if that sort of touches upon well-being essentially, but whether there's been any findings in terms of any positives taken from that.
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose that's why the talk wasn't what's the impact of COVID, it was what's the impact of COVID on inequalities. Because yes, there are undoubtedly students who have benefited from greater attention from their parents, more time with their family. You can see that in some of the survey data, you can certainly see it anecdotally. So, and indeed, there will be parents who are worrying about the schooling of their children who have given them huge support. Those children may well actually have learned more because essentially they're getting one-to-one tuition. Unfortunately, however, for every child who experiences that positive aspect, the situation of children living in deprived circumstances are very, very different, and with parents who will really struggle to help. So it is the inequality aspect, as ever, that we should be mindful of. The question also about resilience. I am not a psychologist, so I think we'll have to push that question over to another time. But whether or not a shock like this can build resilience in some, I suspect the answer is yes. But I think what we should be mindful of, particularly in terms of the state and our role in all of this, is to protect those for whom the shock will have been undoubtedly negative.
Yeah, just sort of follow up on that, or despite also not being a psychologist. I mean, I think we're all clear just how important various sort of psychological traits are, like in this case, resilience or conscientiousness, sort of focus, perseverance, all of these things. And I think where we are in terms of our knowledge on this is that those sorts of traits can evolve slowly over time, but we don't really have a very good idea how we can teach resilience, how we can teach perseverance or grit or whatever you want to call these things. I think in order for a student to improve their resilience, let's say, they need to face various problems, and the difficulty of doing that in a school situation is clear, I think. So I think trying to build resilience is a very good thing. Having a global pandemic is not a very good thing and not a good way to do it. So I think if there are any examples of sort of individual cases of that, then that's fantastic. But I think I don't think that's much to set against the massive kind of costs that Anna and I have been talking about.
I think it's also, worth reflecting on sort of what that question really means, which is surely the impact of the pandemic has not been the same for all children. And I think that's definitely true. The other thing is that Simon and I are urging, for example, schools to measure learning loss and measure impact on well-being. And, you might argue, surely schools have got better things to do than go around measuring things. But one of the reasons why you need to measure it is because resource is not unlimited. And it may be that we need to focus resource on a fairly small subgroup, hopefully small, of children who have been very negatively impacted by this. So the child who's had a supportive parents who's come back with higher literacy and a wonderful time with their family, living in a nice environment, probably isn't going to need much help. And by identifying the kids who do need help, they're more likely to mitigate in a more efficient manner.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And we have another question here, which if I could go to Simon first with that, is there any investment required to maintain schooling standards to help cope with different schools going into additional lockdown periods as the pandemic continues? So I think this question is really around the fact that actually at local level, schools are facing lockdown and how there might be an additional investment needed or support for those schools.
If I can answer that in two parts. I mean, and I take the question is about individual schools and local levels. But if we just first of all start with the national level, I think we absolutely need a considerable amount of extra investment. So the kind of the points that we've both been making suggest that pupils are returning to schools now with very substantial deficits, both in terms of their well-being and in terms of their learning, their skills. And again, as Anna said, at the moment we don't really know what that gap is like. I fear that when looking at learning loss in particular, that when schools do start measuring how their kids are doing relative to the same point in time last year, there's a possibility there's just going to be a huge gap, that particularly the younger kids are just way behind where we would have hoped they would be. So in order to kind of deal with that, in order to avoid some of the worst consequences of that, we do need a massive investment to try and probably small group tutoring, something like that, to try and help these kids get back to where they should be. And that is again both in terms of learning and skills, but also in terms of their well-being and their mental health. So the government announced a couple of months ago now an extra £1 billion for this, that sort of split between general support to schools of 650 million and specific support for small group tutoring of 350 million. And that's great. I don't think it's enough. It's maybe inevitable, but still very disappointing that it's happening so slowly. But I think that's got to be a huge focus of the next few months. So coming to the actual question about local school closures and so on. So I think the answer to that has to be yes. Those schools that do close temporarily, and maybe for some students, maybe for all students, they will need more support. I'm sure that's right. They will hopefully they will have plans in place, and they will be able to switch more or less seamlessly, more or less well, to online learning, blended learning for those kids, and that's going to take time and resources to sort out.
So there's a challenge that sort of sitting in the education ecosphere I can see has emerged even in the first week. You have students in school now, you have students in class, but you also have students who are still at home sheltering or quarantining or just not there for various reasons. And if you're simultaneously trying to teach a class and teach it such that someone who's remote can also access it, it's very challenging. Not least of which that the IT in a significant number of schools is not up to the task of live streaming, Zoom, etc. As we see in universities and other things, it's a challenge, but in schools more so. And at the moment, I think the plan seems to be pretty much we'll try and make it work. And I think that's going to be challenging. So even for the schools that don't shut down, I think there will be an issue, the extent to which you are trying to trade off the experience of the classroom versus making sure you can still support children who are not able to come into that classroom.
I think this may have implications for the curriculum going forward. I mean, in the sense that a lot of the resources that are available, say for example through Oak, are on particular curricula. So schools may face some some internal pressure to use those curricula so that they can match up the in-classroom and the at-home learning. Whether that's the way we want to go, I think is a question for debate. But I mean, I think that there will be some sense in doing that, at least in the short run.
Thank you. And we have a question here which touches more specifically, and I think in terms of your talk, there was, Simon did bring out particularly around the importance of teachers. And the question here is around the support for teachers, which is quite interesting because at school level and also obviously at higher education, teachers have had to adapt at pace to sort of big changes in terms of the way they're teaching and delivering. And I think it's in terms of, what support and also, for example, mentoring and support for teachers as they sort of facing the challenges ahead. And that's the question I think that is being asked of you both. And I wonder, Anna, did you want to start with that, answering that question?
Yeah, sure. I can. I mean, Simon perhaps might want to talk about, the importance of teachers, what we mean by that. Perhaps I could focus on something else, which we've been talking about, the mental health and well-being of students and the impact of COVID. Now, of course, that's also an impact on adults and teachers. And more than that, I think the adaptation of practice has been very challenging, and particularly in schools over the summer term. So many teachers are very apprehensive about what this year might bring. And as I've just described, now they're entering a classroom where they're trying to teach the class in the normal way, but worrying about the 4 students at home who are online, and they can't necessarily get to talk to their peers in the staff room in the way that they would have done, making for a difficult work environment. Now, obviously, everybody at the moment is in the same boat to some degree. I mean, COVID has had negative impacts on us all and the way we work. But I think what people sometimes forget is that going back to that relationship between children and teacher, the reason why teachers can be so impactful is because of their influence on children. And that is partly determined by their own state of mind, attitude, expectations, aspirations, etc. And so we do need to support teachers because how they feel will no doubt cascade down to the children. And when we say support teachers, it's an easy thing to say, but what do we actually mean? What do they need? And I suspect that it may not be some of the things that they get. So I'm sure that many schools are talking about teacher well-being. If you ask teachers, what they might need is more resource or a TA in every classroom, because this year is going to be very difficult. That might have more impact. So whilst I think teacher well-being is hugely important, it's not clear to me that sort of well-being oriented interventions are what's most needed here, as distinct from clear plans and more investment.
So I totally agree with all of that. I think that's absolutely right. I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that just as there are with students and families, there's going to be huge variability between teachers. Some teachers, I guess maybe the relatively younger teachers are going to be very much at home with online resources, providing materials, providing links, maybe doing some editing, all that kind of thing. And they will probably enjoy doing that, and will certainly find it very straightforward to master the technology, the software, the hardware, and so on, and kind of know what to do and kind of know the sort of thing that students are used to seeing on social media and how to sort of package things up in that nice way. And there will be teachers who are none of those things, who don't really consume much of that and have certainly got no idea how to actually make something or produce something. There's going to be a whole range. So I think probably what part of the support that the question raised and that Anna answered is going to be a kind of very small scale, very specific kind of CPD, some kind of training. And I guess ideally what people might like would be some kind of templates that maybe there's bound to be someone in every school, several people in every school who are kind of really good at this, teachers who kind of know how this works and want to do it, who could help their other colleagues for whom it's brand new and really very scary. So some kind of templates, role models, leaders in a school who can help their other colleagues to prepare, to curate, to choose online resources and how to mold that into a package for their kids. I have to say that's happening at universities too. So I'm sure Anna too. I'm having, and many others of us are having to think how to recast my teaching in a blended way or in a purely online way, learning about video editing, learning about different software and different ways of doing things. And that's quite scary. It's also very time consuming. So I think some kind of support. So again, same thing. I have colleagues who are very good at that kind of thing, very used to that sort of thing. And I'm certainly planning on plundering their knowledge in a wholesale way over the next few weeks and months.
Thank you, and thank you both for answering that question. And the next question I've got here is really around the practical teaching element. So obviously a lot of teaching is sort of hands-on practical. For secondary school pupils, what are your thoughts about missed opportunities for practical teaching, for example, the science labs, as a result of the new guidance this year? So I think it's a bit of a more of a broader policy sort of question, but is there anything that you think that could, that support that could be offered for students essentially with that kind of the fact that they won't have that practical teaching element that they've missed already? Or support?
I think it's fair to say that not many families are going to have Bunsen burners or dissection kits at home. So I think I don't really see any way around that. I mean, you're just not going to be able to do that kind of hands-on thing. You can watch videos of other people doing it. You can learn about it. But in terms of if practical means hands-on, doing it yourself, then for most science in secondary schools, I would say it's very sad, but I don't see any way around that, to be honest.
And I think it also highlights another issue, which is that in many schools, practicals had become a less important part of the curriculum as well. It's been really challenging to maintain practicals as a core part of the science curriculum. They're costly and they have other sort of issues around scheduling and such like. And my real hope is that we don't let the pandemic sort of push us into an experiment-free zone. I should say I have a declaration of interest here, living with a physicist. You can do practicals because our kitchen and our garden has been used to that effect. And there are many hands-on things that you can do, particularly with lower secondary. And that's fantastic for the enthusiast who has a kitchen to use these things in. But I think realistically, given the demands on teachers' time, and particularly now that they're back in the classroom and then worrying about how to support children still at home, the notion that you'll get large numbers of teachers able to kind of do those practicals in a fun way on Zoom is a bit unrealistic. But I would just say we need to make sure they come back in when this is over.
Thank you. And I've got a question here around, and I think it's really around what you were talking about, the inequalities faced by families and sort of parents, carers. So, for example, and there was just a question which is quite specific around that perhaps the people that were already home educating families were possibly prepared for continuing learning, but there's this whole issue around sort of social isolation and the well-being, and I think maybe support for those for I guess the well-being essentially of families, which I think you've sort of touched upon essentially. But I think it's around sort of the different experiences that families and parents and carers will have experienced just during this time.
I mean, I think homeschooling in normal times, homeschooling can be very successful. I think it's really important that we don't give that label to what's been going on over the last few months for everybody. It's a very different sort of experience. So if you happen to be all set up to teach your kids at home, then you can just carry on teaching your kids at home in terms of the learning aspect. But I think what was the number? I think in April or May, it was estimated to be 1.6 billion kids around the world who were engaging in learning at home. And again, I think that's a bit of a euphemism really for what went on in very many households. So I mean, in terms of the social isolation, that would clearly change in the pandemic from before.
Yeah, and it's worth saying that people who homeschool often have quite structured ways in order to build in social connections for their children. Indeed, activities specifically designed to bring in that peer-to-peer interaction precisely because they're not in school. So those will have been negatively impacted just as for children who normally go into school. So I think whilst on the learning side, I guess the homeschoolers probably had the advantage. I think we need to be a bit careful before we assume that there wasn't any negative impact on wellbeing and mental health for that particular group.
Yes, and I think that's what the question was referring to, that perhaps although there was, they would have been prepared in terms of the teaching side, that it was around the potential impact on well-being and how sort of the social isolation would have affected that particular group. And then I've got a more broader question, if I could ask first Simon and then Anna. What do you feel that we need really to get a better grip on how we should respond to the pandemic throughout the year ahead, and what could be done in terms of what we should be doing, taking things forward essentially? And if Simon could answer that one first, thank you.
Okay, well, that's precisely the subject of the Royal Society report that Anna and I and others wrote in, I guess, June, July. So there's obviously a lot one could say about that. Not least the precisely the kind of resources and techniques for switching between in-person and online learning. But I'm just going to focus on one point, which is about the institutional structure of who decides when a school has to temporarily close. And we're quite concerned about this because at the moment it seems to be really quite muddled and it's not clear who gets to make the decision. So there are a number of concerned bodies. Obviously, there's the school leadership itself. If the school is part of a multi-academy trust, then there's the trust leadership. There's the local authority. There's Public Health England and whatever replaces that. There's the Joint Biosecurity Centre, there's the Department for Education, local directors of disease infection control. So at the moment, there's lots of people involved in, potentially involved in deciding what level of infection causes means a school has to close in part or in full, and what level of infection we can reopen the school. And this seems to us writing the report to be an absolutely central question. Who's going to have access to this data, and who's going to make the decision? Can the head teacher decide to close or reopen the school? All sorts of other people. And I really feel that it's already 1 week in, we've seen thankfully a small number of schools had to close in part or in full, hopefully for a very short period of time. But this is going to continue. Probably there will be more as time goes on, and we need a structure, a decision and data structure that will allow those decisions to be made transparently, quickly, clearly, and very cleanly. And at the moment, we don't have that. So for me, that's one of the priorities. Something that needs to be sorted out very, very quickly.
Yes, and I talked about a COVID policy that's focused on children and youth, and by that I mean we need to prioritise trying to keep schools open. There's been a lot of discourse in the newspapers and such like about whether we should open schools, whether children are at risk, whether teachers are at risk, whether their parents are at risk. All of which is, people are right to be concerned. But the big issue is, what will we need to sacrifice in order to keep the infection level low enough that we can keep schools open? So it's a complex argument. It's basically saying that we may need to stop certain social activities, for example, in order to keep infection levels low enough that our children can go to school. I know that there has been some concern that asking people, for example, to go to work, but not allowing them to see their grandma is an unreasonable thing. Well, when it comes to the schools, I think we're going to have to ask people to do things that don't feel necessarily that reasonable, which is you can't go to the pub because your kids need to go to school. That's a really hard thing, and we need really good communication to kind of articulate why it is that schools play such a vital role in our society for our children, for our youth, and why we need to keep them open.
Totally agree. Very good.
And thank you both. That's really helpful. I was wondering if I could ask Simon this question, which is really in terms of what we can learn from internationally approaches that have been made in terms of addressing educational inequality. And I was wondering if there's any sort of particular approaches which you think internationally have been helpful in this area.
Educational inequalities in general. I mean, there are very long-standing differences between countries in terms of educational inequalities. I mean, that's just a massive, massive question. I think in terms of the impact of COVID on educational inequalities, I think that depends on different decisions that governments have made about the ability to provide education for children and the length of time that schools have been shut or open. I mean, some countries, say Sweden, never shut schools for children below, I think, age 16. Denmark brought schools back, did shut schools, but brought schools back open very quickly. And I think all of these things, you know, I think we've both demonstrated that having schools shut raises inequalities in all sorts of things. Therefore, opening schools will tend to ameliorate that. So, with all of the caveats, all the obvious caveats, and echoing what Anna just said so well, we have to do what it takes to make sure that schools can reopen. I think that's really important for managing the educational inequalities arising from COVID.
And I think that's right, absolutely. And there's a sort of big answer to the question, which is pre-COVID, countries that were less unequal economically tended to have more equal outcomes educationally. And so, one aspect of tackling educational inequality is to tackle other inequalities. And by other, I mean economic, but also inequalities identified by Marmot, for example, in health and well-being. What does that mean for COVID? Well, it does mean that, going back to what I said in my presentation, the economics of this really matters, and the negative economic impact on families, children, youth is going to be considerable. It will exacerbate inequalities. We know that going into it. So one of our policy objectives should be to minimize the economic negative impact on families, because that in turn is likely to minimize the educational inequalities that might emerge. There's also a more pragmatic thing, which is many countries are doing asymptomatic testing and widespread testing to try to identify more quickly where infections are rising and sort of respond very quickly. And I suppose in educational institutions, that's also a real necessity in terms of getting on top of infection spikes so that we can minimize the time that schools stay closed, and indeed universities.
Thank you. And then we have another question here around risks. So how many risks and benefits should we be considering in relation to, so for example, education versus infection, and how the risks should be considered against sort of benefits? And if I could ask that question for Simon, please.
Well, the title of our Royal Society report was Balancing the Risk of Children Returning to School. There are risks both ways. If you open schools, then the risks are around infection for pupils, their families, teachers, their families, and other staff in schools as well. The risks of keeping schools shut are, as we've been discussing here, around lost learning, lost life chances, lower prosperity, also rising inequality, and so on, and all of the things that those bring. So those are the two risks: the risks of infection and the risks of increased poverty and inequality, and just general lower prosperity from a less skilled workforce. So that's the balance. When we reviewed the evidence at the start of the summer, it seemed to us completely clear that the risks of children becoming very ill from COVID are really very, very low indeed. Schools do not appear to be, on the basis of the evidence at the time, a major source of transmission in general. It's not saying it never happens, just saying they're not a major risk relative to pubs and things like that. So our view of the scientific evidence at the time, and I don't think we've seen anything to change our minds, was that the balance of the risks was that we should do everything we can to open schools safely. So both parts of that statement are important. Paramount policy goal should be to keep the schools open, but we need to do that as safely as we can, and therefore we need to undertake various policy actions to make sure that we can do that. And those were detailed in our report, both in terms of sort of micro things that schools themselves can do within their own context, and sort of macro policy system-wide things that the government can do. Some of those we've talked about.
And I totally agree. The only thing to add to that is also thinking very hard about how we communicate what the reality is on the ground. So, for example, some schools have shut. It's far too early for the teachers involved to have picked up COVID from the kids. It'll be teachers coming in with COVID due to other social contacts. But I fear that the correlation in timing between opening everything up, gyms going back, schools opening, pubs opening, universities opening, the temptation to kind of see all these things as causes of transmission will be great. And what we need is, really robust local epidemiological data that tries to identify major sources of transmission and shut them down before we shut down schools.
Thank you, and that was a point I was going to add, and I just wondered if I could have your final comments really around the importance of data and statistics, which we've seen throughout here, and whether you had anything to add in terms of that. And I wonder if I could start with Simon first on that point at all, in terms of the importance of statistics and data.
Data is absolutely crucial. It's absolutely crucial to generate the evidence on the basis of which we policymakers, government can recommend decisions and courses of action. And in terms of individual actors in this situation, schools, local authorities, whatever, they need local clear data in order to make the right decisions. So absolutely central.
And just to add to that, I mean, there's data that we need to collect, and we detail that in the report, but there's also ensuring access to the data that already exists so that we can use it for the analysis. And data access has improved during the pandemic, but it is by no means a straightforward issue. And I think that's something that we need to work on, both for this pandemic and for future public health risks that we might encounter. My understanding is the Royal Society Delve group may be doing they are doing a report on data deficiencies, if you want to call it that, lack of data. So I guess watch this space.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And thank you so much for your contributions and time, and for answering many questions as well. I think it's been a really interesting talk, and it's really sort of helped to highlight some of the key sort of areas of challenges, I think, in terms of educational inequality, and perhaps also some of the ways we can sort of go forward, and in terms of sort of the data that we might need, and also some of the areas that should be considered, and also looking, as you say, a key thing around looking at the risks and benefits. So thank you so much for your time and contributions today. It's been a really interesting talk, and thank you also for everyone for sending in through your questions, which has really made it a very interesting session for everyone. Thank you very much then. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Carol, for sharing. Great
Thank you. Bye.